This is the last actual painting exercise. A landscape. My reference is one of the pre-selected. If you want, you can find your own reference. There should be these elements on the reference. Things that are clearly in the foreground, in the middle ground, and in the background. It's also good that there's same objects in the foreground, background, and middle ground. For example, the same kind of trees. It's also important that you can easily tell the elements from apart. In the foreground there can be textured areas, but some are really tricky to paint. For example, long grass. Bushes and rocks are quite easy. If possible, it's good that you have a water element on the landscape. The shores of rivers and lakes draw a recognizable perspective to the image. This is the first phase of the exercise. We paint the base for the landscape. We block in the elements of the landscape with their color of the shadow. And we also do some work on the elements on the background. The textures on the fore and middle ground are not painted on this phase. I checked the size of the reference from image size. This image was good sized. The long side over 2500 pixels. If you need, you can just add more pixels, have resample image ticked, and add more pixels to the width. Now I create an exact same canvas. Select all, Ctrl A, copy, Ctrl C, deselect, Ctrl D. Now I create a new file and it will appear as the size of the clipboard. I drag the model to the other side of the reference. Now I relocate the swatches panel to the bottom of the workspace. I create one guideline for the image. I select the line tool, select a fill color, remove the stroke color, and set the weight to 3 pixels. I draw the guideline and move it to the horizon line with the arrow keys. I copy the guideline with the right-click menus, duplicate layer, and set the destination document to be my painting. I go to the canvas file and start painting on the background layer. I start the painting with a good colored fill. After this, I'll start to mix and block in colors with a huge brush. I'm trying to find the colors of the shadows. For the normal painting, I use a similar brush than in the last exercise. But this time I will also use another brush, an airbrush. This is a large, round and soft brush. The hardness of the brush is down to 0. This enables me to make gradients straight to the painting. For example, the sky is super much easier to do with this kind of brush. The size of this brush is also huge. I use this kind of brush when needed, but the painting itself is done with a normal brush. I block in the areas with painting to the positive and negative directions. Usually in a landscape there is an atmospheric perspective. The water droplets and dust on the air changes how the color behaves. The more there is air between the object and the viewer, the more these particles diffuse the light. Normally this changes two things. The red color disappears. This means that the faraway stuff looks more blue. The other thing that disappears is black. This is because there is diffused light from the light areas on top of the shadowed areas. This makes the black gray and normally also blue. Before I already had the colors quite right, but for the demo I changed the colors to be more green. Next we'll paint atmosphere. I do this with a little twist using the lasso tool. I first lasso the sky and the mountains most far away. I then select the color of the atmosphere. This is really light blue. You can add this color to the swatches. Then I'll paint this blue with low opacity on top of the mountains. The light blue color pushes the mountain backwards. I then add the next mountain to the selection. I select the lasso tool and press Shift for the lasso to add areas. I draw the next line to the selection and brush again with an airbrush. Now it went on top of both of the mountains. Again, adding a new mountain with a lasso and a new round of the atmospheric paint. I continue this step by step. Every brushstroke of this light blue color pushes areas backwards. The colors are too green. I add a glaze of low opacity, saturated blue color. This is how you can paint on atmosphere and use the lasso to divide areas to different depths. I continue on painting. I make my brush to be a bit more flat from the round symbol on the right-click menu. I make the skyline clearer with the lasso tool. Removing the selection with Ctrl D. So you can use the lasso also for tight lines. I continue on blocking in the shadow colors of the areas. When I have the approximate colors of the shadows of the areas, I start to block in the areas, painting to the positive and negative directions. You should pay attention to the shadow color of faraway forests. They are not normally green, but blue-gray. In some landscapes, you should use the soft round brush even more. For this example, there is a lot of areas better to paint with a soft brush. After the base color, I paint the landscape normally. I have adjusted my brush tip to be a bit flatter. This can be done from the right-click menu. You can also change the rotation of the brush. On the rocks on this landscape, you can see clearly a light effect. This can also be painted with the round soft brush. But as you can see, the light only affects parts of the rocks. There are dark cracks in between. You can draw these with a lasso tool. I draw the light areas with the lasso, pressing Shift for adding areas. I can also reduce areas from the selection by pressing Alt. This way I can remove the cracks from the selection. When the selection is good, I select the color of the lights. Most common, a light yellow. I take a soft round brush and paint the lights from the direction of the light source. This creates a gradient that seems like light in our eyes. I use this method on my painting to the sides of the rocks on the background. I lasso them and paint the color of the lights. I can also paint the light effects without lassoing. I continue painting normally. I focus on the shores of the water elements. They are the best indicators of perspective in the landscape. I've plugged in the areas and I continue on painting the background. I have to be super careful with the shadows of the background. They should be even flatter in my painting than in the reference. Also, the light areas on the background should be quite flat. I can change the color of the areas by placing a full saturated color with low opacity on top of them. Remember to paint to the positive and negative directions. For example, the holes in the tree foliage should be painted to the negative direction. You can also use lasso for this. I make sure that I don't paint the middle ground and the foreground too light. They should mostly be the color of their shadow. I also make a hierarchy for the details on the background. The mountain on the left is closer, it needs more details. After painting details, you can check the colors again and correct them with a low opacity brushstroke. Now I will work on the sky a bit. Because the mountains are already on their place, I select the sky with Quick Selection tool. Now I'll start painting the areas of the clouds. It's easier if the sky is ready behind the clouds. I paint the bases of the clouds, normally with quite opaque color. I use the middle gray of the cloud. Next I'll block in some of the shadow areas on the bottom of the clouds. Then I'll start painting the lighter colors on top, with the pressure on opacity checked. Now I can blend the colors easier. Clouds are quite tricky to do, and you can spend a lifetime mastering them. Normally they tend up to look really nice if you just use the time on working on them. In this demo, I leave them quite rough. If I have the files open in the same window, I can easily check them by selecting the other file. In landscape painting, we don't care that much if the areas are horizontally in the right place. But it's really important they are the right size vertically. They are the same height. Please check that your faraway mountains are low enough. Otherwise the perspective doesn't work. If the mountains are too high, cut them with the color of the sky. The height of the clouds is important, not the width or the shape. Making the details to the background is quite hard. You all the time need to be vigilant of not putting too much detail there. The more there are details, the closer they appear to the viewer. And I don't want the faraway mountains to look that they are close. I haven't paid a lot of attention to the foreground. I have only plugged in the areas. We work on the textures of the foreground next week. I can paint shine on some of the areas on the clouds with a small round soft brush. I use this glow effect on the clouds and on the snow. I continue on painting details here and there. When the background is done, I concentrate on the areas on the middle ground and on the foreground. Again checking the shadow colors of the foreground. They can be almost black. The hardest for me is the mountain on the left. There is quite a lot of detail there, but I don't want it to be too hairy. I'm now happy with the base painting, the phase 1 of the landscape exercise. I have the elements plugged in, the colors are quite good, the areas far away have been worked on. In the middle ground and foreground, I have painted the forms with their shadows color. Next week we will continue on texturing these areas.